Don't miss out.
What if the fall of Rome wasn't ancient history, but a warning? Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to get the latest videos uncovering history's greatest mysteries and secrets that affect the USA today. Beneath the blistering sun of a Roman July, in the year 100 BCE, a child took his first breath under the weight of a name already ancient, Gaius Julius Caesar. The walls of his family's modest domus echoed with the rituals of tradition, yet trembled faintly with something else, the stirrings of fate. Rome was not yet an empire, not yet gilded in the gold of conquest or stained in the crimson of betrayal. But the boy swaddled in cloth and ambition would change all of that. He would come to command the destiny of millions, and it all began here, in the shadowed heart of the Roman Republic. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to walk into history, not as a witness, but as its author? Caesar did not begin as a god among men. He was born into the Julii, a patrician line noble in blood but dwindling in influence. They claimed descent from Venus herself, the goddess of love and beauty. Yet there was little beauty left in their dwindling fortunes. Rome in Caesar's youth was a powder keg, erupting with class war, political decay, and the distant thunder of expansion. The Senate teetered between tradition and reform, its marble halls echoing not with reason, but with rage, and young Caesar. He watched. He listened, and he remembered. His father, a respected but unremarkable magistrate, died suddenly when Caesar was just 16. The death cracked the ground beneath him, stripping him of security, pushing him toward the uncertain. But perhaps loss was his first tutor. Perhaps grief whispered to him of glory. With his father gone, Caesar became the head of the household. It was a heavy mantle for a boy still learning to shave, yet from the beginning he bore it with a quiet fire. Not the loud arrogance of those born to inherit, but the burning resolve of one born to earn. At 17, he did something reckless, or perhaps something calculated. He married Cornelia, the daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, a man hated by the ruling dictator Sulla. In a world where allegiances meant survival, this was an open rebellion. Sulla demanded he divorce her. Caesar refused. Would you have made the same choice if the cost was your life? The dictator didn't take defiance kindly. Caesar was stripped of his inheritance, his priesthood revoked, his dowry gone. Hunted through the crumbling back streets of Rome, he fled into exile. He was now a fugitive, surviving not by the sword but by silence, cunning, and the mercy of allies. But Rome never forgets. He wandered through Asia Minor, a land of wild coasts and ancient cities. And there, among its jagged cliffs and blood-washed beaches, Caesar had his first taste of war. He joined the staff of a military commander, studying the chaos of battle like a man learning a new language. But his education was soon interrupted. Not by an enemy, but by pirates. Yes, pirates. As he sailed the Aegean Sea, his ship was taken by Cilician raiders. The young Roman noble was kidnapped, dragged ashore, and held for ransom. But Caesar, ever audacious, laughed in their faces. They demanded 20 talents of silver for his release. He told them he was worth 50, and then he promised to kill them all once he was free. They mocked him, of course. Who wouldn't? This slender youth pacing their deck, quoting poetry, practicing speeches, treating them not as captors, but as an audience. 38 days later, the ransom was paid. Caesar was released. He raised a fleet. He hunted them down, and he crucified every last one. Do you feel it now? That chill in the back of your spine? Not from the cruelty, but from the certainty. The certainty that this man, not yet 25, would never be content to follow. He would command. Returning to Rome, he stepped carefully into politics, slipping through its cracks like smoke. He knew the rules of the game, but more importantly, he knew how to bend them. First, he charmed. His voice, smooth as riverstone. His eyes, sharp, curious, always watching. He flattered, he joked, he seduced. And Rome, ever hungry for spectacle, began to turn toward him. He served as a military tribune, then quaestor in Hispania. where he first looked upon the statue of Alexander the Great and wept, not for joy, but for shame. For at 30, Alexander had conquered half the known world. Caesar had conquered nothing. But his tears were not of weakness. They were a vow. Do you see now how ambition grows, not like fire, but like frost? Slowly, silently, until everything it touches is consumed. He returned to Rome again, but this time with a purpose sharpened into steel. He courted the people, aligned with the populists, and broke bread with the powerful. He rose quickly, Aedile, then Pontifex Maximus, high priest of Rome. Whispers circled him now like vultures. Was he lucky, or was he chosen? But Caesar did not need their answers. He was too busy creating the next question. In 60 BCE, he formed a secret alliance with two of the most powerful men in Rome, Pompey the Great, the general adored by the army, and Crassus, the richest man the Republic had ever known. Together they formed the First Triumvirate, a pact that would shatter the Senate's control and reshape Rome's destiny. It was not built on trust, but on necessity. Each needed the others. Caesar needed military command. Pompey needed land for his veterans. Crassus wanted influence. 3 men. 1 ambition. How long do you think such a truce could last? In 59 BCE, Caesar was elected consul, the highest office in Rome. And from his first day in power, he turned politics into theater. He passed laws for the people, bypassed the Senate, ridiculed the elite. He was loved and loathed. Crowds cheered his name. Enemies plotted in silence. But Caesar, he moved as if untouched by doubt, as if the gods themselves had handed him the Republic's veins and told him to bleed it dry or breathe it new life. And then came Gaul, the land of wild tribes, endless forests, and ancient fears. It was here, on the blood-soaked frontier of the Roman world, that Caesar would forge not just an army, but a legend. 9 years of war. 1 million dead, hundreds of thousands enslaved. And Caesar, triumphant, brutal, brilliant, returned not as a general, but as a force of nature. But Rome had changed. The alliance was dying. Crassus was dead, slaughtered in the east. Pompey had turned toward the Senate. And Caesar stood at the edge of the Rubicon River, holding fate in the palm of his hand. Crossing that river meant war. It meant betrayal, blood, and the death of the Republic. But not crossing. That meant surrender, obscurity, silence. And if there was one thing Caesar could never bear, it was silence. He looked at the water. He looked at the future. And he crossed. The Rubicon was shallow that winter, no more than a thread of cold water winding through the northern Italian landscape. But when Gaius Julius Caesar crossed it in 49 BCE, he did not merely step over a stream. He shattered a republic. The phrase alea iacta est, the die is cast, whispered from his lips like a curse or a prophecy. There was no going back now. With a single act of defiance, Caesar had declared war, not on a nation, but on an idea, that no man could hold ultimate power in Rome. Have you ever stood at the edge of everything you've known, knowing the next step will burn every bridge behind you? Caesar didn't flinch. He marched south, his legions moving like a storm, swift, disciplined, loyal, not to Rome, but to him. He had spent nearly a decade in Gaul forging not just victories, but bonds. These were not soldiers. These were believers. Men who had killed and nearly died by his side. Men who had seen him share their food, sleep on frozen ground, and bleed in battle. They would follow him into the jaws of the Senate. And they did. Panic gripped Rome. Pompey the Great, once Caesar's ally, now his rival, had underestimated him. The Senate had expected a pause, a negotiation, some last grasp at tradition. But Caesar gave them none. His legions moved like a blade through butter. Within weeks, Pompey fled the capital, dragging the Senate elite with him. The city of Rome, eternal, untouchable, lay wide open for Caesar. He did not pillage, he did not punish. Instead, he claimed the seat of power with the calm precision of a man who had already sat upon it in his dreams. The people welcomed him. The aristocrats bristled. And the war, now a civil war, had only just begun. Pompey had not vanished. He regrouped in Greece, raising legions with the backing of the Senate and the eastern provinces. His was the old Rome, the conservative Rome, the Rome of laws and lines that should not be crossed. Caesar's Rome was different. It was born in blood and ambition, and now it wanted everything. For months, the two titans circled one another across the Mediterranean like wolves in fog. Skirmishes flared. Propaganda spread like wildfire. Both sides claimed righteousness. But righteousness means little when the sword is drawn. In 48 BCE, the storm broke at Pharsalus. Have you heard the silence before a battle? That stillness where even the birds seem to hide and every heartbeat sounds like thunder? On that dry plain in Thessaly, Pompey held the advantage. More men, more cavalry, better position. Caesar was outnumbered nearly 2-1, but he had something else. He had time and trust. He waited. He let Pompey come to him. And when the cavalry surged forward, a sweeping flank meant to crush Caesar's line, the general revealed his trap. Hidden among the ranks, his infantry launched a counterattack so disciplined, so precise, it shattered the Senate's elite horsemen like glass. Then, Caesar advanced. His legions moved forward, not with rage, but with rhythm. Pompey's line crumbled, his men fled, and Pompey himself, the once great commander, idol of the Republic, galloped from the battlefield a broken shadow. It should have ended there, but history rarely grants easy conclusions. Pompey fled to Egypt, land of deserts and gods, of dynasties and daggers. He sought refuge with the boy king Ptolemy III. But pharaohs have short memories and long ambitions. On the shores near Alexandria, Pompey was greeted not with shelter, but with silence. A sword. A betrayal. They slit his throat as he stepped from his boat, severing not just his head, but the last thread tying Caesar to the old world. When Caesar arrived days later, he was presented with Pompey's severed head. Imagine for a moment what he felt. Victory, revulsion, grief. They had been allies once, brothers in arms, bound by politics and power. And now, Pompey's eyes stared up at him, lifeless, from a gilded box. Caesar wept, but he did not forgive. He ordered those responsible for the murder executed. And then he turned toward Egypt, a kingdom teetering on the edge of its own civil war. 2 rulers, 1 throne, a conflict centuries in the making. And into that chaos stepped Cleopatra, 17 years old, exiled, daring. She had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters, wrapped in linen like a gift or a gamble. And there, in the candlelit silence of Alexandria, 2 minds met, equally sharp, equally hungry. Was it love, or was it strategy? Perhaps both, perhaps neither. But what followed was more than an affair. It was an alliance. Cleopatra needed a throne. Caesar needed stability in the east, and so, with Roman legions behind him, Caesar waged yet another war. This time not for Rome, but for a queen. Streets ran red with blood. The Library of Alexandria, that ancient sanctuary of knowledge, burned. The Nile watched in silence as history was rewritten by 2 lovers in a world of fire. When the smoke cleared, Cleopatra ruled beside her younger brother, as Caesar decreed. Peace returned to Egypt, for a time. And then, the dictator returned home. But home was no longer the Rome he'd once known. It was quiet, too quiet. The Senate bowed more deeply now. The people cheered more wildly. Statues rose in his image. Temples bore his name. He had been made dictator for life, a title more divine than democratic. But not everyone was cheering. Do you hear it? That murmuring behind marble columns? That rustle of scrolls and secrets? Rome had never trusted kings. The memory of Tarquin, their last monarch, haunted the Republic like a ghost. And now Caesar, cloaked in victory and crowned in laurel, looked more like a king than any man before him. He wore the purple. He sat alone at games. He took his seat before the Senate, never among them, and the whispers began to curl like smoke around his name. Brutus, Cassius, Decimus, old allies, old friends, new doubts. Was he becoming the tyrant they feared? Was Rome already lost? As spring approached, so did the Ides of March. The streets of Rome smelled of rain and betrayal, and in the Senate chambers beneath painted ceilings and stone-eyed gods, blades were being sharpened, not in open rebellion, but in shadows, in silence. Because sometimes, it's not your enemies who destroy you. It's the ones who once called you friend. The Ides of March dawned like any other, soft sunlight spilling through the broken clouds above Rome, the streets stirring with merchants, slaves, and senators. But beneath the hum of daily life, something darker moved. A chill, a hesitation, as if the city itself was holding its breath. March 15th, 44 BCE. Do you ever wonder if the soul can feel what the body cannot? That invisible whisper of fate brushing against your spine, warning you to turn back. Caesar had been warned. The soothsayer's voice had echoed through the forum days before. Beware the Ides of March. He had laughed then, brushing it off like superstition. But that morning, he hesitated. Reports of strange omens had reached his ears, lightning without storm, birds tearing each other apart in the temple rafters, his own wife Calpurnia waking from a dream soaked in dread. She begged him not to go. Stay home. Postpone the Senate meeting. Let the stars settle. But Caesar, ever the soldier, dismissed fear as weakness. Destiny does not wait. Power does not pause. And so, wrapped in his blood-red toga, he stepped into the chariot that would carry him to the Curia of Pompey, the temporary meeting hall of the Senate, cold and shadowed beneath the looming statue of his once rival. The streets parted for him like waves. He did not see the daggers, only the smiles. The men gathered that day were no strangers to Caesar. Many had fought by his side. Others had risen through his patronage, basked in his favor, dined at his table. And yet, in their eyes, a republic flickered like a dying flame. To them, Caesar had become a god, and that was the problem. The Senate, once sacred, had become a stage. Their voices, once thunder, were now whispers drowned beneath the roar of one man's will. If Caesar lived, they feared, Rome would die. Its soul would be lost beneath a crown, so they chose to kill a man, to save an idea. It happened quickly. As Caesar took his seat, the conspirators encircled him, a noose of robes and false pleasantries. Tullius Cimber approached first, pleading for the return of his exiled brother. When Caesar waved him off, Cimber gripped his toga, a signal. The first dagger struck, then another, and another. Steel flashed beneath marble light. Blood sprayed across the floor, hot and sudden. Caesar twisted, stunned, not by the pain, but by the faces. Brutus, Cassius, Trebonius, Decimus, men he trusted, men he loved, and then came the final wound, the one history remembers. As Brutus raised his blade, Caesar faltered. Their eyes met. Something ancient passed between them, betrayal, disbelief, heartbreak. Et tu, Brute? Did he speak those words, or were they imagined, a dramatist's touch upon a silent death? No one knows for certain, but in that moment, something in him broke, not the body, but the spirit. He stopped resisting. He pulled his toga over his face and fell. 23 stab wounds carved their will into his flesh. A god reduced to meat on Senate stone, and above him the statue of Pompey looked on, expressionless, eternal. The conspirators emerged, their hands dripping with justice. They shouted to the crowds that the tyrant was dead, that liberty had returned, but the crowd did not cheer. They stared, not with joy, but with fear. For Rome had not cried out for Caesar to be slain. It had loved him, not just as a general or a politician, but as the father of its future. And now that father lay butchered by those who claimed to protect her. The funeral came days later. A pyre was raised in the forum, surrounded by the restless masses. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general and now his avenger, stood before them. His voice, once controlled, now trembled with fury. He did not speak vengeance. He let the people decide, and they did. As the eulogy ended, a storm of grief swept through the crowd. Someone, no one knows who, hurled a torch into the pyre. The flames caught. The smoke rose. And then, chaos. The mob surged through the city like wildfire. They tore down the homes of the conspirators, hunted their allies, cried for blood. The Senate tried to restore calm, to promise that Caesar's killers were patriots, not murderers. But the tide had turned. Something had awakened in Rome. Not justice, not liberty, revenge. Caesar was gone, but his shadow only grew. Mark Antony, once content to serve, now seized the mantle of rage. He read Caesar's will aloud, revealing that the slain dictator had left money and land to the very people now howling for his vengeance. The man they had murdered had loved them still, and far from Rome, another heir stirred. Gaius Octavius, barely 19, Caesar's grandnephew, a boy with no army, no political weight, but with one weapon that terrified every senator in Rome: a name. In his will, Caesar had adopted Octavius as his son, heir to his fortune, heir to his name, heir to his destiny. Octavius sailed for Rome with ice in his veins and purpose in his heart. The city he entered was no longer a republic. It was a battlefield, not of soldiers, but of symbols. Mark Antony and Octavian, fire and ice, fury and calculation. Together they formed an uneasy alliance, and with Lepidus, a third general, they became the second triumvirate, a legal dictatorship of 3 men with one mission: to erase the assassins. They drew up a list. Prescriptions they were called, names scrawled in ink and sealed with death. Senators, generals, poets. Anyone suspected of treachery was hunted, their heads displayed, their families ruined. Even Cicero, the great orator of Rome, met his end. His hands, once raised in eloquence, were nailed to the rostra as a warning. Rome bled. And still, Caesar's ghost walked. His temple rose in the Forum. His image shone on coins. His name, Divus Julius, the divine Julius, was whispered in prayers. He had crossed the Rubicon, conquered Gaul, and defied the Senate. But it was in death that he became immortal. A man had died, but an empire was being born. The dust of vengeance had not yet settled over Rome. Blood still dried on the marble steps of the Curia, and whispers of war slithered through every tavern and villa. Rome had changed, but the death of Julius Caesar had not restored the Republic. It had shattered its illusion. Power had fractured, and from the shards, new monsters emerged. The second triumvirate, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, ruled not as guardians of the people, but as architects of retribution. Together, they wielded a cold, lawful terror, purging Caesar's enemies in the name of justice. But justice in Rome had always worn a mask, and behind it, ambition grinned. At first, the alliance held. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, was young, unreadable, careful. Antony, older, proven, war-hardened, commanded the legions and the loyalty of Caesar's veterans. Lepidus was the third. History forgets him for a reason. They had promised to govern, to avenge, but Rome knew better. No alliance forged in vengeance could last. Sooner or later, the blades would turn inward. But before the final reckoning, there was unfinished business. Brutus and Cassius, the chief architects of Caesar's murder, had fled east. In Greece, they raised armies, calling themselves the Liberatores, defenders of the Republic. But freedom was a cold banner, and the people did not rally behind them. They remembered Caesar's bread, his games, his reforms, and now they were asked to fight for shadows. Still, war came. 2 years after the Ides of March on the plains of Philippi, the fate of the Republic was sealed. It was not a single battle. It was 2, fought weeks apart, amidst mud, fog, and screams. In the first clash, Brutus struck hard, surprising Octavian's forces and nearly driving him to ruin. Antony, ever the tactician, countered, pushing Cassius back, trapping him on a rocky ridge. Cassius, misinformed, believed Brutus had fallen, and so, on that hill, in the failing light, he chose death. With his own blade, he opened his veins. The man who had plunged the knife into Caesar's heart now felt it turn inward. Brutus wept when he learned the truth. His friend, his co-conspirator, gone. But the war was not finished. In the second battle, Brutus led what remained of the Republican legions. The fighting was desperate, brutal. There were no elegant formations, no noble tactics, only exhaustion, blood, and the weight of lost cause. Brutus was defeated. As the sun rose over the battlefield, he too chose suicide, falling on his sword as his enemies closed in. The Republic had not been saved. It had been buried. Rome was now in the hands of 3 men, and one of them was already fading. Lepidus, never more than a placeholder, was soon stripped of power. Antony and Octavian divided the spoils of empire, east and west. 2 men, 2 visions. And between them, a woman, Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. She was no ordinary monarch. Cleopatra was the last pharaoh of a dying dynasty, brilliant, ambitious, fluent in politics, war, and seduction. She had once bound herself to Caesar, bore him a son, Caesarion, and now she turned to Antony. Their affair was no secret. To Antony, she was power incarnate, wealth, ships, and loyalty. To Octavian, she was a threat. An Eastern queen, pulling Antony from Roman virtue into something older, darker, foreign. Propaganda followed. Octavian, ever the master of perception, painted Antony as a traitor to Rome, bewitched by a temptress, abandoning his duty for Egyptian luxury and Eastern gods. The Senate, weary of war but hungry for order, chose its side, and war returned. The final civil war of the Roman Republic unfolded not on land, but across the waters of Greece. At Actium, in 31 BCE, Antony and Cleopatra's fleet faced Octavian's. It was a battle of wind and fire, catapults screaming, sails burning, the sea turning black with ash and blood. Antony fought with fury, but Octavian planned, and Agrippa, Octavian's admiral, his blade in the sea, outmaneuvered them. Defeat followed, and with it, the end. Antony, wounded, humiliated, fled to Egypt. There, in the echoing halls of her palace, Cleopatra awaited him. Rumors flew that she had betrayed him, that she had died, that all was lost. Desperate, Antony fell on his sword. Bleeding, half dead, he was brought to her, and died in her arms. And Cleopatra? She negotiated, she stalled, she schemed, but Octavian marched. As he entered Alexandria, she prepared for her final act, not as a queen, but as a symbol. She adorned herself in royal robes. She dined once more in her golden chamber, and then, as the asp bit her skin, she breathed her last. With her death, 3,000 years of Egyptian monarchy ended, and Octavian stood alone. No rivals, no republic, no Caesar. But him. The Senate, reduced to ceremony, offered him titles: Imperator, Augustus, Princeps. He accepted them with modest words and absolute authority. He would rule not as a dictator, but as a god's son, a god. Julius Caesar, once mortal, now divine, had paved the way for empire, and Octavian, Augustus, would build it. From Gaul to Judea, from the Rhine to the Nile, the world would bow before Roman order. Pax Romana, they would call it, the Roman peace. But peace, carved from conquest, is never quiet. In Caesar's death, a new age had begun. The Republic had died not with a whisper, but with a scream, a stab, and a crown left unclaimed. And through it all, one truth remained. Rome did not want freedom, it wanted greatness, and Julius Caesar had given them a taste of it. He stood alone now, Augustus, Rome's first emperor, though he never dared call himself that. He preferred Princeps, the first citizen, a man among men, not above them. But the marble masks of power are often delicate, and beneath his lies was an empire. The Republic was dead, but its ghost still haunted the Senate chambers, whispering through statues and scrolls. So Augustus ruled with care, quiet, calculated, not with the thunder of Caesar, but with the chill of inevitability. He reshaped Rome not through open war, but by mastering the illusion of peace. Do you feel it? The silence that follows revolution, the kind that creeps in slowly, not as a relief, but a warning. Augustus would govern for more than 4 decades, and in that time, he would build a machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. Not just roads and aqueducts, not just armies and law. He built a myth. Rome was no longer a city, it was destiny. He declared Caesar a god, raised temples in his name, and in doing so made himself the son of the divine. Divi Filius, a man born of vengeance, reborn as fate. But fate always demands blood. Augustus may have worn the mask of peace, but beneath it was steel. He did not forget those who had laughed when Caesar fell. He hunted them quietly, relentlessly, eliminating rivals, silencing dissent, and reshaping the Senate into a hollow chamber of applause. And yet, Rome flourished. Under his reign, provinces were pacified. Pirates vanished, grain flowed, roads stretched like veins across continents, binding distant lands to the heart of an empire that pulsed with gold, marble, and myth. Children who had never known the Republic were taught that Augustus had saved them from chaos. And perhaps he had. But at what cost? He sacrificed liberty for order, debate for decree. And when he was done, when his body began to break and the gods grew impatient, he prepared a successor. Not a son, not Caesarion, the blood child of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. For he had been murdered, erased, declared a false heir. No. Augustus looked to Tiberius, reluctant, brooding, the stepson of his beloved wife, Livia. Tiberius did not want the crown. He had fled to Rhodes to escape the spotlight of power, but Augustus, ever the puppeteer, called him back, and Rome once again would pretend that power passed through law, not blood, that empire was temporary, not eternal, that Augustus was mortal, not divine. But when he died, in the quiet heat of summer in 14 CE, the people wept as though a god had passed. They buried him in a grand mausoleum on the banks of the Tiber. The man who found Rome of brick and left it of marble was gone, or was he? For even in death Augustus lingered, his shadow stretched across generations, his image printed on coins, carved into stone, whispered in prayers. He had given Rome what it craved: stability, glory, permanence. But the soul of empire is never at peace. Tiberius ruled in his wake, cold, calculating, absent. The Senate feared him. The people never loved him. He withdrew from the city, leaving Rome to his prefect, Sejanus, whose ambition was darker than any Caesar's. Whispers turned to screams. Trials multiplied. Blood returned to the streets. It was the beginning of something worse. After Tiberius came Caligula, the golden boy, the charming heir. At first, he was adored. The people called him Little Boot. They saw in him the spirit of Augustus, the blood of Caesar. He gave them games. He wept at public funerals. He released the unjustly imprisoned. But then, something snapped. Illness, madness, power. He declared himself a god, not metaphorically but literally. Demanded temples, statues, worship. He made his horse a priest. He whispered to the moon, and he bled Rome. His rule became a circus of cruelty. Senators were executed for sport, families destroyed for amusement. No one was safe, not in the courts, not in the palaces, not even in their dreams. He was not Caesar, he was nightmare, until one day, in a shadowed corridor of his own palace, the Praetorian Guard turned, daggers, silence, and a body left in the dust. But the game was not over. From the chaos stepped Claudius, uncle to Caligula, overlooked, mocked, thought to be a stammering fool. But fools make excellent survivors, and Claudius ruled. He expanded the empire, brought Britain under Roman command, reformed bureaucracy. He restored what Caligula had burned. Yet in Rome, restoration is temporary. For after Claudius came Nero, and Nero would make even madness weep. But that is for another night. For now, remember this. Julius Caesar died for ambition, Augustus ruled through illusion, and every emperor after carried their shadow like a curse, because Rome did not want freedom. It wanted gods, and gods always fall. Fire. It began quietly. A flicker near the Circus Maximus. A single flame dancing in the dark, innocent. Until it wasn't. Rome, the heart of the empire, the city of 1,000,000 souls, awoke to the crackling roar of death. Wooden tenements ignited like dry parchment. Winds fed the inferno. Columns cracked, statues melted, temples crumbled, and above it all, untouched, stood the Palatine Hill. And Nero. Did he watch it burn? Did he really play his lyre, composing verses as his people screamed? We may never know the truth, but the legend never dies. This was Nero, heir of the Julio-Claudian bloodline, last in a line born from Caesar's ambition and Augustus's illusion. At first he was young, handsome, curious, a lover of poetry, a patron of the arts. The people rejoiced. Perhaps he would be a gentle emperor, a citizen of culture, not war. But power does not care for poetry. It infects the soul, and Nero surrendered. His reign descended into shadows. He had his own mother, Agrippina, the woman who had paved his path to the throne, murdered, not cleanly, first by collapsing ceiling, then drowning, finally, by the sword. She died whispering, "Strike the womb that bore him." And so he did. He married, then murdered. Married again, and murdered again. He accused senators of treason and watched their forced suicides like theater. The court became a stage, and Rome a tragedy. He raced chariots, sang in theaters, and demanded applause, not from fans, but from subjects. Mandatory, ritualistic, hollow. And when the fire came, when the city turned to ash, he saw opportunity. He blamed the Christians, an obscure underground cult spreading a new faith of humility, peace, and defiance. They were easy targets, foreign, strange, refusing to honor the gods. So Nero hunted them, burned them alive, crucified them along the roads, drenched them in oil, and set them alight as torches in his gardens. Do you feel it? The silence between screams? The empire was rotting, from the inside out. Yet Nero still dreamt of a new Rome, a golden Rome. He took the ruins and laid foundations for a palace so vast, so decadent, that it sickened even the elites. Domus Aurea, the golden house, stretched across acres of stolen land. At its center stood a colossal statue of himself, not an emperor, a god. But Rome had seen this before, and it was growing tired. Revolts flared in the provinces. Governors refused orders. Armies stopped saluting. And when the Senate finally turned, Nero fled, not as a ruler, but as a fugitive. He hid in a villa outside Rome, alone, desperate, terrified, and there, he asked a servant to kill him. When the blade pierced his throat, he choked on his final words, "What an artist dies in me." And with him died the Julio-Claudian line, a century of divine lineage, gone in a whisper. Rome plunged into chaos. 4 emperors would rise and fall in a single year. The Praetorian Guard auctioned the throne to the highest bidder. Provinces revolted. Armies marched not against enemies, but each other. It was no longer a republic, not even truly an empire. It was a carcass, fought over by wolves. But then came Vespasian, a soldier, stern. No lineage of Caesar or Augustus, no myth, just grit. He crushed the rebellions, restored order, drained the chaos, and from the ashes, he built again. He began construction on the Flavian Amphitheater, what we now call the Colosseum, a monument not to gods or emperors, but to Rome's endurance. His sons, Titus and Domitian, would follow him. Titus opened the Colosseum with 100 days of blood and spectacle. He ruled briefly, dying of fever and sorrow. And Domitian? He ruled longer, but colder, harsher. Paranoid and cruel, he bled the Senate dry and trusted no one. They assassinated him in his own palace. A servant with a dagger, the same old song. And so, centuries after Caesar crossed the Rubicon, the empire stood, still vast, still glorious, but trembling beneath its golden skin. Its heart? Hollow. Its gods? Dead or mad. And the people still cheering, still watching, still hoping. Because Rome was more than marble and legions. It was a myth you could live in, a dream you didn't dare wake from. But dreams always end. They came from the north, not in silence, but with thunder. With hooves that beat like war drums. With axes carved from frozen forests. With songs of fire and frost in tongues Rome did not understand. And they were not one people, not one tribe, not one army. They were many: Goths, Vandals, Franks, Huns. The old empire, once held together by legions, by law, by Latin, now cracked like ancient marble beneath their weight. But long before they breached the walls, Rome had already begun to rot from within. The Senate, once sacred, now whispered in shadows. The emperors? They were no longer the titans of Caesar's line. They were puppets, often soldiers, proclaimed in dusty corners of far-flung provinces. Some reigned for years, others for days. How did it all fall apart? How does a god bleed? Let's go back to the man who made division his answer, Diocletian. In a crumbling world, he tried to save the dream, not with hope, but with architecture. He split the empire in two, east and west, Greek and Latin, sun and stone. Rome could no longer be governed by one man, he said. And so came the Tetrarchy, 4 rulers, ruling together. It worked. For a moment, but ambition doesn't share power. Not for long. Within a few decades, civil war returned. Emperor fought emperor, brother against brother. And in the chaos rose a name that still echoes in every church, every cathedral, every whisper of Western civilization. Constantine. He claimed a vision, a sign in the sky. In hoc signo vinces, in this sign you shall conquer. A cross. He marched under Christian banners. He battled at the Milvian Bridge, where the Tiber ran red. And when he won, he did not restore the pagan temples. He embraced the God of the persecuted. Christianity, once fed to lions, now fed the empire. He made it legal, then favored, then sacred. And in the East, he founded a new capital, Constantinople. The old Rome, with its crumbling forums and fading glory, still stood. But the heartbeat had moved eastward, closer to the wealth, the trade, the future. The West? It limped. Taxes rose, borders bent, soldiers deserted. And the barbarians were no longer just invaders. They were inside. They served in Roman legions. They settled Roman lands. They married Roman women. They wore Roman titles. And yet, they were never Roman. Not truly. In 410, the unimaginable happened. Alaric the Goth marched on Rome, and Rome, the eternal city, the untouchable jewel of civilization, fell. They sacked her temples, plundered her palaces, ransacked her sanctuaries. St. Jerome wrote, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." Do you feel it? The silence, after 1,000 years of noise, the disbelief that the wolf's children had grown old and weak, but it was not the end. Rome staggered on, wounded, yes, but breathing. For decades more, emperors ruled, mostly in name, rarely in power, and then came 476. A boy sat on the throne, Romulus Augustulus, barely a teenager. The last Roman emperor in the West. He was dethroned by a barbarian general named Odoacer. No civil war, no grand finale, just resignation. The empire didn't explode, it exhaled, a slow, tired breath after centuries of pretending. And yet, the East lived on. The Byzantine Empire, with its mosaics and spies, its Greek scriptures and Roman laws, claimed the legacy. For 1,000 more years, It carried the torch. But it was not Rome, Rome as Caesar dreamed it, as Augustus built it, as Nero burned it, as Constantine baptized it, was gone. But was it? Look around, in the language you speak, in the calendar you follow, in the law that binds your world, in the architecture that shapes your cities, in the stories you tell of glory, ambition, betrayal. Rome never truly died. It simply changed costumes. Because empires don't vanish. They dissolve into memory, into myth, and myths are immortal. The ashes of empires do not settle quietly. Even after the Western Roman Empire collapsed into the dust of its own contradictions, the echo of its glory rippled across centuries, drawing dreamers, tyrants, popes, and kings to chase a ghost crowned in laurel. You see, Rome may have fallen, but the idea of Rome never did. In the vacuum it left behind, darkness spread, roads decayed, trade withered, cities shrank. Europe entered what we now call the Dark Ages, not because the sun stopped shining, but because the flame of civilization flickered low, shielded only by monks in stone monasteries copying forgotten scrolls by candlelight. And in that long twilight, whispers of Rome became prophecies. Who would revive the empire? Who would wear the mantle of Caesar? First, it was the church. The bishops of Rome, once persecuted, now powerful, began to reshape the spiritual map. As pagan temples crumbled, basilicas rose, and atop the ruins of the old Forum, the Pope emerged, not as a soldier but as a shepherd, yet behind the robes of humility was the steel of power. And when the barbarian kings knelt before the throne of St. Peter, something ancient stirred. Then came a man from the cold forests of the Franks, Charles, tall, ruthless, charismatic. He conquered lands from the Pyrenees to the Danube. He forced conversions with the edge of a sword. He united a broken Europe under one crown. And on Christmas Day in the year 800, in the hallowed silence of the old Basilica of St. Peter, Pope Leo III placed a crown upon his head and spoke the words, Imperator Romanorum, Emperor of the Romans, Charlemagne. In that moment, something strange happened. The Roman Empire, dead for over 3 centuries, was reborn, not in Rome, not in Greek Byzantium, but in the cold heart of the North. But what was it really? A revival or a resurrection stitched together by ambition and myth? Charlemagne's empire didn't last. It fractured after his death, torn by greed, jealousy, and blood. But the title survived, passed like a relic through the hands of German kings and Austrian emperors. They called it the Holy Roman Empire. Voltaire would mock it centuries later, saying it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, but names are powerful, and this name carried the shadow of Caesar. Yet the true Rome, the one of marble and myth, still lingered in the east, Constantinople, the last heir to the old flame. For 1,000 years it held the line, a Roman island in a sea of shifting empires. It spoke Greek, prayed to Christ, fought Persians, Arabs, Crusaders. It built cathedrals like Hagia Sophia, so vast, so glorious, that even enemies stood in awe. But the circle had to close. In 1453, the walls of Constantinople finally fell. Cannons thundered, janissaries stormed. The last emperor, Constantine V, drew his sword and vanished into legend, his body never found. The city was taken. The empire ended, and the Ottomans. They claimed the crown. Sultans began calling themselves Caesar of Rome, Kaiser I Rum, another mask, another echo. Still, the world kept spinning. New powers rose. Spain, England, France. Nations, not emperors. Parliaments, not Caesars. But the myth of Rome refused to die. Napoleon seized it, crowned himself emperor, claimed to be the true heir, marching his armies across Europe as if replaying Caesar's campaign with muskets instead of swords. He held the laurel. He crossed his Rubicon, and like the men before him, he fell. Then came Mussolini, a man drunk on ancient statues and fascist dreams. He called himself the new Caesar, rebuilt Roman monuments, marched in black shirts beneath arches and eagles. But it was theater, and like Nero, he ended in ruin, hung by his feet. his mistress beside him, mocked, broken. The Roman dream had once again devoured its disciple. But if you think this story ends in tombs and museums, you haven't been paying attention. Rome is still here, in the language of your law, in the shape of your government, in the arches that hold your bridges, in the calendar that rules your life, in the stories of power, betrayal, destiny. You see it in Washington, in Moscow, in Berlin, in every marble column raised by those who seek legitimacy through myth. Rome was never just a city, it was an idea, a virus of civilization, a whisper that says, you too can rule the world. But what happens when an idea becomes more powerful than the flesh that once wore its crown? What becomes of a legacy too vast, too haunting, to be buried? You followed the rise, the glory, the fall, but the true weight of Caesar's life was not in his victories, nor in the blood that soaked the marble of the Senate floor. It was in what came after, because when Caesar died, he didn't vanish. He multiplied, in names, in myths, in bloodlines and blueprints. He became a cipher for ambition. But let us step back, not to his death, but to the breathless hours that followed it. The Ides of March had passed. Caesar's body, riddled with 23 wounds, lay cooling beneath the statues of former tyrants, a brutal irony not lost on anyone in the Roman Forum. His white toga, once a symbol of Roman dignity, soaked crimson. Blood pooled at the feet of Pompey's likeness, the very man he had crushed in civil war. And yet, silence. The conspirators had no plan. They killed the man, but not the myth. And Rome hesitated. Crowds gathered, word spread, first whispers, then cries, then fury. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general and one-time friend, seized the moment. He wrapped himself in grief and theater. He spoke at the funeral with fire in his voice and a dagger in his hand. And when he lifted Caesar's bloodied robe before the crowd, the spell broke. They rioted. They torched the homes of the assassins. They tore apart the Republic with their bare hands. But this chaos was not a revolution. It was a reckoning, because behind Antony, someone was waiting. Octavian, barely 19, sickly, unassuming, but Caesar's heir, by blood and by will. He had been adopted in name, but raised in the long shadow of that towering figure. And when Rome needed stability, when the streets demanded vengeance, it was this boy who stepped into the storm. He would become Augustus. But not yet. First, there would be war. Antony and Octavian, allies in public, rivals in secret, hunted down Brutus and Cassius. They marched east, united by vengeance. At Philippi, they met the last defenders of the old republic and destroyed them. Brutus fell on his sword, Cassius too. The dream of the Senate died on a foreign battlefield, but what replaced it was not peace. Antony turned his gaze to Egypt, to Cleopatra, to luxury, to lust, and Octavian, he watched, he waited. He understood what Caesar had not. Power was not in war, but in perception. Antony was painted as a traitor, a man seduced by a foreign queen, a would-be king who abandoned Roman values for Eastern decadence. The Senate, fearful but desperate, turned to Octavian. He answered with fire. At Actium, his fleet broke Antony's navy. Cleopatra fled. Antony followed, and as Octavian's legions closed in, the lovers sealed their fate with poison and blades. It was done. The world belonged to one man, and this time, it would stay that way. He did not call himself king. He knew better. Instead, Octavian became princeps, first citizen. He spoke of restoring the republic, of tradition, of Roman virtue, but behind every word was control. He became Augustus, and the republic became the empire. Not with a shout, but a whisper. Not with tyranny, but with order. Temples were rebuilt. Roads stretched farther than ever before. A golden age of poets, builders, and thinkers emerged. Peace, Pax Romana, settled across the empire like a calm after storm. But at its center was still the throne. The idea that one man could be Rome. Julius Caesar had torn open the Republic. Augustus stitched it into an empire. And though statues of both would stand side by side, it was the ghost of the murdered dictator that made the imperial crown shimmer with such danger and allure, because every emperor that followed would live in Caesar's shadow. Some embraced it, some ran from it, all were devoured by it. And now, we come to the end. But how do you end a story that never truly finishes? Because Caesar's tale, his ambition, his betrayal, his legacy, was never just about one man. It became a pattern, etched into the DNA of empires. You see, after Augustus came Tiberius, then Caligula, then Claudius, then Nero. Each one carrying the weight of Caesar's crown, but none able to wear it without consequence. Tiberius ruled in fear, retreating into paranoia, executing those who whispered his name too softly in the dark. Caligula turned madness into spectacle, his cruelty dressed as divinity. He declared himself a god, built temples to himself, appointed his horse to the Senate, not because he loved animals, but because he hated the men who sat there. Claudius, the stammering scholar, tried to rule with reason, and was poisoned by his own wife. And Nero, oh, Nero, he fiddled as Rome burned. He raced chariots in private circuses while senators vanished in the night. He murdered his mother, he sang to empty theaters, and when the world finally turned on him, he fled with a single servant and a trembling hand. His last words, "What an artist dies in me." But it wasn't artistry that haunted the empire, it was the throne itself, the imperium that Caesar's blood had unlocked. For centuries after, emperors would rise and fall, some wise, some wicked, all consumed by the machinery of a system built on one man's broken dream. Vespasian, Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius. They expanded the empire's reach to the edges of the known world, but they could never escape its rot. Because with every new Caesar came the same question: who comes next? Succession, once the Senate's privilege, had become a gamble of blood and steel. Assassinations, civil wars, poisoned goblets and whispered conspiracies, generals crowned by their legions, children declared gods, and all the while Rome devoured itself from within. The Senate, hollowed out. The people, distracted by bread and circuses. The emperors, puppets or tyrants, or both. And yet somehow Rome endured. For over 400 years after Caesar's death, the Western Empire clawed its way forward, until at last it could go no further. Barbarians stormed the gates, gold ran dry, the legions stopped marching, and in 476 AD, the last emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, a boy no one remembers, was quietly deposed by a German warlord. No grand battle, no final stand, just a whisper, and then silence. But the East lived on. In Byzantium, emperors still called themselves Caesar, still dressed in purple, still clung to the dream, until 1453, until the last walls fell and the last Roman died with a sword in his hand and fire at his back. And yet, you feel it, don't you? It's still here, in our capitals, our institutions, our obsessions with legacy, power, charisma, every leader who speaks of destiny, every nation that calls itself eternal, every citizen who believes in empire, even if they no longer use the word. Because Julius Caesar was never just a man, he was a mirror. He showed us what we are and what we become when ambition outruns restraint. He walked into the storm of history with open eyes. He crossed the Rubicon knowing there was no return, and when he fell to the blades of those he once called friends, he left behind a question that echoes through every palace and parliament even now. What are you willing to sacrifice to reshape the world? You've followed his footsteps. You've seen the rise, the blood, the fire. Now ask yourself, would you have followed him or would you have stabbed him? Because Rome never ends. It just waits for the next Caesar, for the next Ides, for the next empire to believe. It will be different, but it never is. Sleep well, citizen. The dream of Rome continues.